So what do I see as the future for volunteering in a post-COVID world? It's a cool question. It's one that's being asked a lot at the moment on online forums, and I think the natural tendency is to think about how people will volunteer a little bit more in terms of, you know, engaging with Zoom and online learning and things like that. But personally, I think that there is an opportunity here for us to think about other ways that volunteering might occur in a post-COVID world. And so I want to begin, I guess, by thinking through this notion that if there is one thing that we learn from history, it is that we just do not learn from history. And so while we can hypothesize all we like around what might be may actually just be what we always had. I think that is a pretty distinct possibility, maybe with a few tweaks around the edges, and maybe volunteering is not going to be that different in a post-COVID world than it was in a pre-COVID world. That is definitely a possibility, I think, that we should keep in our minds as we kind of ponder this question.
I think communities will need and will start to begin finding solutions for themselves and involve volunteers from those same communities at place with lived experience.
I see the future of volunteering in this post-COVID world full of hope and promise. I feel as though people are going to be able to expand and volunteer in ways that they have never been able to do so before. As a matter of fact, in our own organization, we are now able to welcome virtual volunteers in a way that we've never been able to do it. So not only are we having volunteers within our own city, but we have volunteers literally across the nation. So I really believe that volunteering post-COVID, it's going to have taught us to think outside of the box. It's going to teach us, it's going to challenge us. It's going to, and what I really love about it is that it exposed those places where we were weak. So it's those opportunities now that we can strengthen our programs. It revealed where there might be leaks, like leaks in the ceiling or something like that. And sometimes you really don't know you have a leak in your ceiling until it starts to storm and it starts to rain hard, and then you see it all coming through the ceiling. And it has really opened up our eyes to where we can do better, and will encourage us and push us and move us forward to being better than we'd ever thought that we could have been and would have never realized had this not happened.
I think that virtual or online volunteering will certainly increase. At the same time, I think that people will be somehow more keen to volunteer, to work in teams, and basically to meet, to do activities together once this will be allowed and unrestricted. I think it will feel somehow free, and people will enjoy this sense of freedom and this refreshed energy.
I think the question of volunteering in this COVID-affected and hopefully in the future pandemic-free world is a really interesting one, actually. Here in the UK, I think when we had our first lockdown in the spring of 2020, starting on the 23rd of March, I think volunteering gained a visibility that it really hasn't had in this country, probably since the 2012 Olympic and Paralympic Games in London. I think the news media were very aware and were reporting stories, and the public were very aware that the essential support that was provided to people who were shielding and self-isolating and those who were particularly vulnerable or hard hit by the effects of lockdown was provided predominantly through volunteers. I think the challenge to the volunteering sector from that, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes' time, was probably the fact that most of that volunteering was very informal in nature. It was community groups who self-organised, either community groups who pre-existed, and there's still an unknown about how many of those volunteers were volunteers previously, and how many were new, but it was volunteer groups that came together through social media, organised themselves on networks like Facebook or Nextdoor to provide support to each other in their local communities, sometimes just at street level, sometimes broader estate and neighbourhood level. And I think that kind of high volume of volunteering and that high awareness of volunteering really gave an enthusiasm to the whole volunteering movement in this country in a way that, as I say, we hadn't probably seen in the previous 8 years.
So looking forward, I think we'll continue to see organisations utilising the new and different ways of working that they've already got used to using through COVID. I hope that we see embracing onboarding that takes advantage of the technologies for onboarding and training so that these processes can be sped up and more accessible. So we know there's a shift towards virtual volunteering, remote-based volunteering, and these tools make that more easily able to be instigated.
The other area that I think will change in the near future is preparedness volunteering, and preparedness volunteering becoming part of every organisation that has volunteers involved. But I think now national governments and organisations collaborating with them must include planning on how volunteers respond to new types of disasters, to epidemics of the future, or disasters that we have not even imagined yet.
I think the fact that COVID has almost forced volunteers to do a couple of things, I think they are going to also be important. One of those things is that volunteers have been forced to tackle technology in a way that maybe they haven't before.
I also think that more types of volunteering will emerge, and it will become more popular and more natural. As a resource center for volunteering, we work with the formal volunteering, or the one that is done under the scope of the volunteering law. And it can be monitored, it can be reported. But we surely cannot ignore there is also informal or sporadic or unorganized volunteering that simply happens because citizens decide to act upon issues that they see around themselves. And I for sure think that this will continue to take place and actually to increase all these civic groups appearing. I think they are very, very good sign of a healthy society.
I guess another trend that may hit us very, very early on in the coming months, coming years, is the real dangers of unemployment and recession. What impact would that have on volunteering? Well, put it this way, I believe there's going to be a lot more people with a lot more skills looking to volunteer their time. One, to keep active, and two, to share their skills, to keep going while they're looking for employment, to keep going while they're waiting for the economy to bounce back again. So we need to adapt better as organisations and find community solutions that can harness these skills. And these volunteers will want to use these skills. They're not going to want to be put photocopying pieces of paper or stuffing envelopes all day. They've got real skills and they'll be offering those to us.
Hello friends in Auckland. Kia ora. Voluntary action has universal values. It's about individuals acting for the common good, each in her or his immediate local community for a very specific and delimited task, but it's about taking each of us our own little bit of responsibility for the general interest. It's a huge puzzle of differences, but that takes care of the common world. If we nurture ways to connect, we are actually able to contribute as active citizens to global governance. Because this is the final goal, I think common and shared, like one world more just and equal for all.
We've certainly got a lot to learn in terms of New Zealand and Australia and your reaction to the pandemic last year and how successful you've been. But I think for us, it's also looking at that thing of whether people are going to return to volunteering post the pandemic. And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about right now, not just tomorrow or the next day, but in 6 months or a year's time. What will volunteering look like? Will the volunteers that we had last March before lockdown in Ireland return to volunteering? We don't think so. We've been talking to our colleagues in Israel around their experiences, and it's been quite interesting in terms of how they've met with the challenges that have been there in terms of civil unrest in the country before, and people reflecting on their volunteering and thinking about whether they will return. And right now we know that a lot of organisations haven't been in contact with their volunteers for some time, and that's a challenge in terms of getting those people back on board next year in terms of, hey, we're all ready to go again, and we're like, we haven't heard from you for the last 6 months or 12 months, like, we've moved on. So society has changed. I think very much volunteering is going to change. And I think for us, certainly here in Ireland, that's going to be a complete shift from primarily formal volunteering that we see at the moment to informal volunteering. And we've seen that already in terms of the reaction of people wanting to get involved. During the early stages of the pandemic here in Ireland, we had 27,500 people come forward interested in volunteering. And we know they're keen and they're interested, but they probably don't want to get involved in terms of formal volunteering. They see that as a barrier. So we're working right now with those volunteers to bring them on board in terms of our new National Volunteer Corps that we're developing. But also we need to start working with those organisations, those volunteer involving organisations on the ground, to get them to change their mindset in terms of, we've been doing it for the last 25 years and we're not going to change it. Needs to be, it's a new cohort of volunteers. It's not going to be the same volunteers that will return to us post-pandemic. We need to look at the ways of engaging these informal volunteers, how we might build bridges to them, whether that be through virtual volunteering, informal volunteering, volunteering from home, all of those things which sometimes are left out on the periphery by organisations. We know from our own organisations that people are still talking about virtual volunteering being something new, when in fact it's been around for a long, long time.
For those 2 or 3 months that we were in lockdown between March and the summer of 2020, in the UK at least, we stopped becoming an economy because most of the economy had closed down, and we actually started becoming a society where looking out for each other was really, really important in a way that I think it's always been there, but it's always been hidden and suppressed. I mean, even as far back as Margaret Thatcher in the 80s and 90s saying there's no such thing as society. So I think that was a really interesting juxtaposition, that there was this massive growth in volunteering, or awareness of volunteering, I should say, at the same time as most traditional activity ground to a halt. I think the other thing that we saw at the time here in the UK, or at least in England, was the day after our lockdown started, the launch of the NHS Volunteer Responders Scheme, which was a much more top-down, formalised structure to provide exactly the same kind of support and help in local communities that was being done informally. And that attracted some 750,000 applications of interest within the first week, of which 600,000 were then processed to be volunteers. But by the latter half of 2020, only about half of those had actually been given anything to do. And I think that was a big lesson in both how we can actually mobilise very, very quickly. I mean, I applied to volunteer with that programme and was applied on a smartphone in less than 5 minutes. and was approved as a volunteer in less than 24 hours to do the kind of thing that if I'd have had to have done applied 2 or 3 months beforehand prior to the pandemic, I would have had to have gone through all kinds of additional vetting hoops.
I think the role of the volunteer manager will continue to be important. It always has been, but in some ways you may need more volunteer management within your organisations with if you're seeing changes into your volunteer workforce, that brings with it recruitment, induction, training, and also obviously the heightened requirements around operating in a pandemic environment.
How can we engage these people who are at home? How do we harness the time and goodwill of thousands, if not millions, of volunteers at home? It should not be a matter of keeping volunteers engaged while they're at home. It should be a matter of finding solutions for volunteers to actually contribute from home.
The other thing I think that is a little bit of a hidden post-pandemic kind of issue will be just who returns to volunteering. And by that I mean, I've always kind of had this fun little tagline that says it's often harder to get out of volunteering than it is to get into it. And by that I mean that often people get engaged and then the organisations are often so desperate for volunteers that volunteers always feel like they can never leave. And on the flip side, many volunteer leaders come into organisations where there is such a strong volunteering culture that is just about impossible to break. And so I think that in some ways COVID is going to be a bit of a circuit breaker on both sides of that equation. What I mean by that is I think that for many volunteers who have looked for an opportunity to silently kind of get out of their volunteering commitments in a way that is respectful to the organisation and so forth, I think they will take that opportunity and not return to volunteering. I think there is going to be a whole new generation who are now going to be working from home and have a lot more flexibility with their time who may enter volunteering. And I also believe that for many volunteer involving organisations, that they will take this opportunity not necessarily to bring everybody back on board. And that's going to be the opportunity for those who are wanting to create a new culture in their organisations to do that as well.
In regards to the post-COVID world, I think we're at a really interesting moment around volunteering in the UK. I'm recording this in the middle of January, and our vaccination programme is well underway, and volunteers have been integral to that. St John Ambulance recruiting volunteers, as well as local NHS bodies, and in some instances working with the local community sector to do that. And that's everything from marshalling queues outside of vaccination centres to providing support to people who are needle phobic, and in the case of trained St John Ambulance volunteers, also administering vaccinations as well. And I think that's a brilliant opportunity for us to showcase the importance of volunteering in our society and how fundamental volunteering is to the rollout of the vaccination programme and to day-to-day life in our society, whether it was pre-pandemic, during pandemic, post-pandemic. So I think that's going to be really interesting. It's also thrown up some quite fascinating perceptions amongst people as well. So there was a phone in on a TV show before Christmas where one lady had called in saying she was needle phobic, but she was absolutely going to get the vaccine, but she didn't want to be vaccinated by a volunteer. In other words, the assumption being that because they were a volunteer, they were untrained and they were amateur. So I think it raises the opportunity for us to have some really interesting debates over the course of the next few months about the place of volunteering in society and the place of volunteering within the delivery of public services. Because if we manage to achieve the aim in this country of vaccinating every single adult, and that vaccination programme is successful by the end of September, then that will only have been possible through a combination of paid staff and volunteer labour. If it was just left to paid staff, we would never achieve that goal by September of this year. And so that raises a really interesting debate for us around the role and place of volunteering. So I think there's a lot of very interesting things that are going to come in the future.
Calling our community who are isolated in their own homes, picking up and delivering shopping, FaceTiming, Zoom, using technology, linking communities via technology, organised by volunteers. So we need to be planning a lot more proactively instead of dealing with emergencies reactively. I think in the future, every organisation should have a volunteering emergency plan.
I've never been a great believer that technology was a huge barrier from a volunteer side of things anyway, but I think the opportunities for people to engage in volunteering in different ways, particularly using online forums like Zoom and others, maybe not so much even to do volunteering, but to be engaged in the volunteer experience and to be able to undertake education and collaborate with others and chat with other volunteers and all of those kind of things that typically didn't occur in volunteering well pre-COVID. I think that might be a little bit of a game changer. And by that I mean that in many institutions, volunteering was somewhere that you went, you did your opportunity, you had your volunteering, you went home, and a week later you were re-engaged in that same way. It was only kind of that top end of volunteer involving organisations that engage volunteers otherwise. And I think volunteers will now understand that opportunity as well.
Also, on a very national level, I would say, with a rather cultural perspective on the question, I believe in our part of the world, in Eastern Europe and specifically in Romania, there will be more variety in the profile of the volunteers. The pandemic has brought more adult volunteers because employees found themselves with more time at the onset of the lockdown back in March 2020, and they wanted to find concrete ways to contribute to the crisis that they saw and they felt around them. So they offered to volunteer, and we could really see a big increase in the adult volunteers who before were rather rarely active in the traditional volunteering activities. Why? Because these are somehow clearly targeted towards those with larger amounts of free time, the youth or the students, or sometimes even the elderly. So now we have an entire pool of new volunteers discovering very concrete ways to pitch in, to offer their time, and at the same time to meaningfully spend their time, while waiting for the situation to get solved and not wanting to go crazy indoors. So I believe this has opened a new opportunity for people over 25 or over 35 to volunteer and to actively look for other opportunities, also outside the scope of the pandemic-related needs. Because they now got a taste of it. They saw the immediate results of this engagement. They got to know NGOs and community actors, and they are now really much more in touch with the community needs. So for sure they will continue.
I think too, for the future, we need to start imagining, I mentioned this earlier, and it sounds a little bit morbid, but we need to imagine the disasters of the future. What can volunteers in our organisations do in the event of disaster? Disasters are going to affect the communities we serve. We can't just shut up shop every time it happens and stay at home. Again, talking about volunteers. What, for example, would we do in the event of, say, worldwide technology crashing? Imagine no internet, no ATMs, no flights due to navigation tools being down. How do we plan for that? What would a volunteer response be to that? We can no longer ignore these things and say, look, we'll deal with that if it happens. We may think that's stuff of a disaster movie. But disaster movies are happening right now.
When we do enter a post-pandemic world, I think there's going to be a lot of volunteers who are enthusiastic about getting back to their normal lives, and volunteering may well, at least temporarily, drop down their priority lists as they prioritise travel and seeing family and friends and going and doing the things that we've not been able to do for most of the last year. So there's a really interesting question for me about whether we're going to see a sharp, albeit hopefully temporary, dip in volunteering at the end of the pandemic before potentially that then picks up again later on.
The final thing I would throw in that I think is a bit of an unknown still, but definitely something that we should consider, is whether or not the whole COVID thing is going to be that opportunity to help large industries to really embrace technology in a much greater way. While the voluntary sector has felt the impacts of volunteering, of the pandemic, for industry, it's been cataclysmic. So they haven't been able to undertake the work that they would typically do. And I wonder if this will be a time that they will automate so much more of their workforce, bring in more technology, bring in more robotics, so that if another pandemic was ever to hit, they're not going to be in the same position that they were this time. The reason I mention that is what impact, if that was to come to the fore, what impact might that have on the availability for people to volunteer? So suddenly we may have this huge workforce that have a lot more time on their hands to volunteer, and that may be a fillip for volunteering, but it has a lot of other demographic kind of considerations as well. So as you're working through your thinking today and your deliberations, that would be the other thing that I would throw on the table. So just a few thoughts from me. I hope that they're helpful.
The other thing we'll really need to focus into our future is the younger generation of volunteering. Here in Australia, government mandated that all volunteers aged 70 and over stay at home during the worst part of the pandemic. Now, can you imagine the impact that had on services that utilise volunteers in aged care facilities, in hospitals, in retail stores, mainly made up of retirees and a lot of volunteers in that age. So COVID, in that sense, has been a huge wake-up call. We've always wanted to engage younger people in volunteering, but I do sense that there hasn't been an urgency around that in the past, and there needs to be an urgency now. And we must co-design solutions with our young people. We need to finally get rid of our biased and old-fashioned views on younger volunteers. And I still hear volunteer managers and coordinators come up with the old chestnuts of, you know, we can't rely on young people, they don't stay, they're not committed, etc., etc. We need to engage them. We need to get them involved in, again, co-designing solutions. The youth of the future will be drawn to environmental groups and activist groups. You look at Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, climate action, movements like Black Lives Matter, Get Up, and Amnesty, just to name a few. You know, I'm thinking the word volunteering itself may even disappear if it is seen by our younger people as being archaic, representing older white privilege, and bound by red tape and bureaucracy. So what can we do as traditional organisation to attract those people? What do we need to drop? What fundamental work do we need to undertake to attract the newer generation of volunteers?